As we know, there are some Asian Americans living in the United States during the Cold War years before 1965. So, an interesting question is this: as the Cold War escalates and reaches a boiling point, what are going to happen to those Asian Americans, specifically because of their national origin as immigrants? So, this leads us to a discussion of how both Chinese and Japanese, in particular, would experience this transfiguration, if you will, in the way they would be perceived by the United States, by Americans in mainstream society. Okay, now we know this that during World War II, China was our friend. It was an ally in our fight to defeat the Japanese Empire. So therefore, China, well, we tended to think of them in more friendly terms. Okay, compared to Japan, of course, who were the enemy. So you start seeing this reflected in mainstream media. For example, like Time Magazine or Life Magazine. Both these magazines were extremely popular and had wide readership and therefore played a role in shaping public opinion back then. So you start seeing articles published in these magazines, such as this. Notice on this slide, the name of this article is How to Tell Japs from the Chinese. And if we look at the, back-to-back comparisons here, we have this Chinese person. Notice his demeanor in the photograph. He's smiling. He looks friendly, right? And that's in contrast to the Japanese person who has a scowl and does not look friendly. And they even attach physical characteristics to each person that help you supposedly distinguish between someone who's Chinese and someone who's Japanese. As they put here, the Chinese person supposedly has yellow complexion, more frequent epicanthic fold. By the way, an epicanthic fold is that fold of skin over the eye, right? That makes the Asian eye, the typical Asian eye, more smaller than, let's say, other racial groups, right? Higher bridge compared to the Japanese, right? The Chinese person never has rosy cheeks, has a lighter facial bones, longer, narrower face, scant beard. That's opposed to the Japanese person who has an earthy yellow complexion, less frequent epicanthic fold compared to the Chinese, sometimes has rosy cheeks, as opposed to never, right, with the Chinese, has a heavy beard as opposed to scant beard, and generally has a broader, shorter face and massive cheek and jawbone. That's how you distinguish between the Chinese versus the Japanese, according to this magazine. Now, in another magazine, Time Magazine, here's a quote that was published by Time Magazine during World War II. The Japanese are short, seldom fat, and often dry up and grow lean as they age. The Chinese, on the other hand, put on weight. Their faces are placid, kind, and open. Okay. Another thing that Time Magazine published is that the Japanese were more dogmatic and arrogant compared to the Chinese. So notice that, right? It's a form of essentialization, if you will. Right? Let's remember back in the day of Yellow Peril, where the Chinese were depicted as sinister, evil, and so forth, as a threat to American morals. Now, they are essentialized as this friendly person compared to the Japanese, of course. But that was during World War II. What about the Cold War? Well, now China, who was once our ally, is now our enemy once China turned communist in 1949. And Japan, as we know, was now our ally. So this means a reversal here in the way both groups would be depicted. The Chinese will now be depicted as let's call it a return to the sinister yellow peril, right? And the Japanese would be reinscribed as model minorities in the United States. Now, one fear that spread among Americans in terms of Chinese presence in the United States was that they would constitute this fifth column, if you will, in terms of, espionage, right? And indeed, the director of the FBI back then during the Cold War years, J. Edgar Hoover was his name, he connected Chinese communism to Chinese Americans. In fact, Hoover pronounced that Chinese Americans, right, not Chinese, but Chinese Americans, as our number one enemy, quote unquote. Okay, and to continue with the quote, he says, some of whom could be susceptible to recruitment either through ethnic ties or hostage situations because of relatives in communist China. And here's another quote from J. Edgar Hoover expressing the same concern. Quote, the large number of Chinese entering this country as immigrants provides Red China with a channel to dispatch to the U.S. undercover agents on intelligence assignments, unquote. Okay, so the fear, of course, was that the Chinese would constitute this ring of spies entering the United States. And this fear launched something called the Chinese Confession Program. And this photograph here is one that shows a roundup of such suspects. Okay, so what was this? Well, it was launched by a government agency that was around back then called the INS, Immigration Naturalization Services, the INS. And it was an informal program, okay? Had no appointed officials, no guidelines, and they kind of operated impromptu, sort of impromptu actions and activities. But the purpose here was that due to the fear of Chinese immigrants entering illegally from, quote, Red China, well, we had to put a stop to that. Okay. Now, this has a little bit of explanation in terms of why they launched the Chinese Confession Program. There was high-ranking government official in the Hong Kong consulate during the early 50s, and he supposedly got word of this ring of spies coming in from Red China, to use that term, into the United States. So he warns the U.S. government of this, okay, even though it was largely unsubstantiated. And moreover, how they were getting inside the U.S. Involved this elaborate scheme of false passports and false visas, okay, so they were all fraudulent. That's how they were supposedly bringing in communist spies to the U.S. So again, the INS is charged with trying to uncover what was going on here. And they begin by just posting ads in newspapers, talking to civil leaders in the Chinese community. And they urged the Chinese who had a history of fraudulent entry into the U.S. to come forward, to volunteer to come forward. And they even urge them to report other family members and friends who may have entered fraudulently into the United States. Now, this involves an earlier incident of fraudulent entry into the United States that happens in the first 2 decades of the 1900s. Okay, so we have to roll back to that to see how it connects with the Chinese Confession Program. Now, going back to 1906, that was the year when this great earthquake destroyed much of San Francisco. Many buildings were destroyed, infrastructure was demolished, and therefore the city had to rebuild much of San Francisco back then. But one thing that happened is the building that housed the public birth records and the immigration documents of the Chinese immigrants was destroyed. Okay, so just like that, all this record of Chinese immigration was destroyed, lost forever. So the Chinese, becoming aware of this fact, began to claim that they were indeed citizens, okay, because there's no way to disprove their claim with the loss of those public records. Now, one thing that these persons began to do is go back to China and see if they could sell a quote unquote slot to come to the United States. What is this slot? Well, as you know, you could bring relatives of the citizens to come in, right, to the United States. You could petition relatives. Um, and therefore, this person who was likely lying that he was a citizen could actually bring in a relative, or he could bring in someone who wants to come to the United States and pretend to be his relative, right? And he would sell that slot, so to speak, as an immigrant pathway to the United States. So again, that quote unquote citizen um, was making money off this, right? Selling that slot to that Chinese immigrant who desires to come to the United States. So, on record, they claim to be relatives. Many of them claim to be sons of these petitioners, but in fact, they were not. Okay, they were only sons on paper. So this gave rise to this term called quote unquote paper sons. So, what were paper sons? And I should add to that paper daughters because there were some women who migrated under those false pretenses. Well, paper sons or paper daughters were those Chinese immigrants coming into the United States who claimed to be actual relatives of that petitioner, but in fact, they were not. Okay, they came in fraudulently. And let's also recall that the petitioner itself was engaged in fraudulent activity, claiming to be a citizen and therefore having the rights to petition family members. Okay, so again, this is fraudulent immigration to the U.S. And those individuals again became known as paper sons or paper daughters. Now, let's fast forward to the Chinese confession program and recall that the INS urged all those Chinese Americans to come forward if they had a history of fraudulent entry to the United States. And this was, again, voluntary, but indeed, many Chinese Americans voluntarily came forward, reported to the INS to say they came in fraudulently. But it was not a form of fifth column that was coming in, right? It was not a ring of spies. In fact, they admitted that they came in as quote unquote paper sons or paper daughters. Okay. So that is that interesting connection with the Chinese confession program and paper sons, paper daughters. Now, what would happen eventually is that INS agents would actually enter Chinatowns or other communities with large Chinese American populations, and they would stop Chinese Americans in the streets and ask them for valid documentation. Okay, and this became a regular part of Chinese American experience after a while. And in fact, here's a quote from a Chinese American who was interviewed about this. He said, quote, "They would stop you in the street, harass you, push you around. It became part of our daily lives in Chinatown at that time," quote unquote. Okay, again, it was largely an informal program, but you had these agents basically harassing Chinese Americans and to try to inquire whether or not they were spies, right? Well, this continued, by the way, this began in the 1950s and it continued until the mid 1960s. But by that time, almost 14,000 Chinese Americans confessed, many of them due to having a family history of paper sons and paper daughters, not to being actual spies, right? So that's the Chinese confession program. And again, it's this roundup of Chinese who were thought to be this fifth column of spies, when in fact, sure, they came in fraudulently, of course, but you know, it was under a different system of fraudulent entry, the paper son